if they act as an enemy and try to destroy the Jewish state, try to intercept, as I said, convoys on roads, and then if Israel is under threat or under aggression at the specific point in time, then there's a problem. They are a time bomb.
If someone is controversial, what does that actually mean? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, controversial relates to causing much discussion, disagreement, or argument. If I would have to put a predicate on Professor Benny Morris, then the adjective controversial would probably be the one. But that's not necessarily something negative. The way I see it, causing discussions, real discussions, could help us to resolve some of the global crises we are facing today. But what makes Benny Morris so controversial? What did he do or say to antagonize Israel's left as much as Israel's right? By the way, that fact in itself could be seen as an achievement. Well, for one, he used a rare window of opportunity in the 1980s, when Israel's archives briefly opened, to study and publish many of Zionism's dirty secrets. From rapes, massacres and transfers to ethnic cleansing and Zionism's attempts from the very beginning to uncompromisingly create a greater Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. In fact, Morris and others showed that the Jewish militias often met little or no resistance from the local population, which were mainly rural peasant farmers, and that nevertheless almost 500 villages were eradicated and the population, often quite brutally, driven from their homes and land. So with these publications under his belt, no wonder the Israel's right was pretty upset, to say the least. And here is where the story gets a twist. Noam Chomsky, in one of his interviews with me, put it this way: you have to separate Benny Morris the historian, who delivered excellent work, from Benny Morris and his personal views, some of which could be interpreted as the views of a right-wing hardliner. Surprise, Benny Morris is a human, with strengths and weaknesses. In his case, the side you stand on determines which is which. To keep this in perspective, and almost as if to counterbalance the controversy on the right, Benny Morris ignited a firestorm within Israel's left when he argued that the expulsions in certain conditions don't constitute war crimes, or that Ben Gurion, the founder of Israel, made a fatal mistake by not cleansing Israel from all Arabs when he had a chance to do so. I think you understand now why he's viewed as controversial in both the left and the right-leaning political camps. It should also be clear by now what the contradictions between Morris the historian and Morris the person are. This being said, and no matter what you think of Benny Morris, his work and writings are based on academic research and historical facts, facts as documented by Zionism itself, facts because they shed light on Zionism's darkest secrets, counter the carefully crafted but fictitious narrative from the most moral army in the world that conquered a land without people for a people without land. And when it comes to Benny Morris the person, he is of course an Israeli. He views the world like anyone else through the lens of his own experiences. He applies pragmatism in its purest form, but in doing so detaches himself emotionally completely from the situation when he argues that you have to break eggs to make an omelette. The problem is that while in essence this is true, it completely neglects the human suffering on the part of the Palestinian population. From their point of view, the Nakba, the great catastrophe, never stopped but is still ongoing today. And if you had a chance to watch any of the recent videos on social media depicting armed settlers supported by the army virtually chasing Palestinians from their homes, often with brute force, while burning their houses, cars and olive trees, you understand why. Good morning, Professor Benny Morris. How are you today?
Okay, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time. I was really looking forward to this conversation. I have a number of screens here, all are plastered full with notes, because your personality and your life's work is simply incredible. So I will try to encapsulate this in a couple of short sentences. You're the son of immigrants from England. You were born in a kibbutz. You were a left-wing. So sorry, you were a member of a left-wing youth movement when you were young. You were a reporter for the Jerusalem Post. You refused to do military service in the territories, and if I'm not mistaken, you were even arrested for that.
I was jailed for 21 days.
21 days, okay. You were, or you still are, a professor of history at the Ben Gurion University.
I was.
You were. And you were, I think, and this is I think most crucial, you were a member or even a founder of the so-called New Historian movement in the 1980s, right?
I suppose you could say that, yes.
Okay. On a less pleasant note, some have even called you an Israel hater at some period in your life. You were shunned by the Israeli academia for uncovering war crimes committed against Palestinians, right? Now you have managed to be celebrated and condemned by the left, and you have also managed to be celebrated and condemned by the right. Okay,
so I must be doing something wrong.
You must have done something right, actually. Okay, and I think okay. So you have written many books and many academic articles, but I do believe that two books that demonstrate this bipolarity best is, on one hand, the book Righteous Victims: A History of the Zionist Arab Conflict, on one side, and on the other book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. Could you, in a nutshell, outline the different approaches for those two different books?
I'm not sure there are different approaches. The book on the refugee problem, which in fact I wrote twice and published twice, once originally in 1988 and then expanded it in 2004, looked at how the Palestinian refugee problem emerged in the 1948 war. And it included the descriptions of Israeli war crimes, which contributed to the creation of the refugee problem. So that's one book, and that was, of course, resented by a lot of people in the Israeli establishment who had basically swept under the carpet the whole subject. The other book, which was published in 1999, Righteous Victims, is an overall survey of the conflict in 700 pages of the whole conflict from the 1880s until more or less 1999. And I think gave a balanced picture of what had happened, who made mistakes, who did the right things, who made peace offers, who rejected them, and so on. And I think a lot of people on the left didn't like it, especially because it also found the Arabs in some way culpable in the conflict.
Yeah, I have read a number of articles. I have watched, I don't know anymore how many interviews that you have given. And the one thing that struck me was you are quite outspoken, but also very pragmatic, even in risky topics, right? So you view the things that happened really through the detached lens of a scientist, so to speak, right?
I try to, yes.
Yeah. I would like to focus in this conversation really on what's happening today. This is where I want to go with this whole conversation.
Okay.
But there is no way that we cannot discuss, or let's say it's a good segue into the topic if we start with the New Historian movement. Could you please explain maybe what it was, how you came into it? I know you have done this many times. I've heard it, but I still would like you to let's say encapsulate. That's number one. And number two, also states some of the most controversial arguments that flowed from that movement.
Okay, well, I wouldn't call it a movement. It's a number of people whom in 1988 I sort of joined together and said this is a new something in the historiography of the Israeli-Arab conflict. There were 3, 4, 5 of us. So we hadn't even discussed it, but I coined this phrase, the new historiography. as compared to the old historiography. The old historiography was essentially the Israeli official Zionist history of what had happened in 48 and before that and subsequently. And if you like, also the old and traditional historiography by the Palestinian Arabs of what had happened in 48 as well. Though I wouldn't call that old historiography, because that's the narrative they still cling to. They have not changed or revised anything. On the Israeli side, Israel opened many of its archives in the 1980s, and the new generation had come into history. Myself and a few others, we were then sort of young, and we looked at this newly opened material and discovered that it didn't really conform to the establishment history of the conflict, which had been published in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I called it the new historiography. A number of major topics were tackled by the new historians. I myself tackled the subject of the Palestinian refugee problem and how it came about, how it originated in 48. The traditional Arab explanation was the Jews with predetermination, the Zionists with predetermination and systematic and organized way expelled everybody, because that was the ideology and that was the policy of the newborn Israeli government in 48. The traditional Zionist explanation of how the refugee problem had come about was that, well, the Palestinians launched the war, and their own leaders basically advised or told them to get out of harm's way and to leave the country or leave their villages and towns. And when the Arabs won, they could come back. So in other words, it was essentially Arab-instigated departure or exodus from Palestine. And we're talking about 700,000 Palestinians who were uprooted from their homes altogether in the 1948 conflict. What the documentation which I discovered in Israeli, British, American, United Nations archives in the 1980s was that the truth probably lay somewhere between these two. I can go into that later if you like more, what exactly happened and why Palestinians became so-called refugees. That was one subject tackled by the new historiography. Another subject was the relations between Israel or the Zionist movement, and then Israel and Jordan's King Abdullah and the British in what happened in 1948, how this informed what happened in 1948. This was basically tackled by Professor Avi Schleim, formerly from Oxford University, and he basically found, and I more or less agree with it because I also went over the material and found some additional material, wrote my own book on the subject. He found that Israel and the Jordanians, or the Zionist movement and King Abdullah of Jordan, basically with British agreement, agreed to partition Palestine between themselves, between Israel and Jordan, rather than between Israel and the Palestinians. In other words, both Israel and Jordan were against the establishment of a Palestinian state, as envisaged by the United Nations Partition Resolution of 1947. So the Jordanians occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem, what's today called the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in the course of the 48 war. Israel occupied most of the rest of the territory, and the two divided it between themselves, and no Palestinian state emerged from the conflict, as in some way, as I say, envisaged by the United Nations in 1947. Some people call this a conspiracy. Avi Schleim called it a collusion across the Jordan, but this essentially was realpolitik on the side of both sides. The Jordanian monarchy hated the leadership of the Palestinian national movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini, its leader, who had collaborated with the Nazis in World War II, and opposed Jordan's annexation of the West Bank because he wanted to set up his own Palestinian state there. And the Jordanians, of course, the Israelis, of course, had been the target of countless bouts of violence by the Palestinians, so certainly didn't want the Palestinians achieving statehood and therefore power as their neighbor. So this was a second subject tackled by the new historians. A third subject, which most people don't relate to, is the balance of power between the two sides. What happened in the 1948 war is that Israel beat the Palestinian militias in the first part of the war, and then beat the Arab armies, Jordan's, Syria's, Egypt's, and Iraq's, all of whom invaded Palestine on the 15th of May, 1948. They were basically contained, the Arab armies, by the Israeli troops, and eventually they were pushed back, and ultimately this meant defeat of the Arab states. Why did this come about? Well, some people in Israel said it was a miracle, but essentially it was because Israel, though the Jewish community in Palestine at the time numbered altogether 650,000 people, and the Arab states had tens of millions population, and the Palestinians, in terms of population, were twice as large as the Jewish community in Palestine. But nonetheless, the Jews won. And the key to the victory was organization and motivation, I would say. That is, the Jews were highly motivated because the Holocaust had occurred a few years before. They did not want a second Holocaust happening in Palestine, so they were willing to sacrifice and do everything they could to stop the Arabs from winning the war. And they organized themselves, unlike the Arabs, who didn't get organized properly and also lacked finances to mount a long-term war. The Arabs also are unmotivated in the sense that troops from Egypt, from faraway Egypt and from faraway Iraq, were fighting in a foreign country. So why should they, kill themselves for the Palestinians or for a bit of territory in Palestine, which is not theirs? The Jews were fighting for their lives and for their families who were just behind them. And as I say, had this memory of the Holocaust motivating them as well. The Arabs initially, the Arab states were much better armed than the Jews, but their armies, they didn't manage to mobilize a lot of troops. Their armies were very small, and the Jews managed to mobilize, by the end of the 48 war, 1 in 7 of the population in uniform. In other words, 100,000 Jews out of those 650,000 were soldiers. So the Jews managed to field more troops than the Arab states combined, as strange as this may sound. And all of these things together, they also financed the Jews by World Jewry. World Jewry didn't assist them mostly in manpower, but it did assist the community in Palestine with a lot of funds, which made them able to wage war successfully. Those are 3 of the main issues. A 4th issue was, why was no peace achieved at the end of the 48 war? So often wars end in peace agreements. The Arabs basically said it was the Jews' fault. The Jews said it was the Arabs' fault. The new historians, especially Avi Schleim and myself, I suppose, looked at the reasons why no peace occurred, and we reached not exactly the same conclusions, but the Arabs in some way were at fault as well as the Jews. Those are the 4 main subjects tackled by the new historians, which in some way offended both Arabs and Israelis.
Thank you for that. So before we move on, I have 4 or 5 little arguments in that direction. Also, let's say the arguments from the new historians. Yeah, I wanted to run them by you. The official version said that Britain tried to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state, but the new historians claimed that it tried to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Let me answer this point first. The British were opposed traditionally to this, not traditionally. From 1917 on, the Balfour Declaration, the British supported the establishment of a Jewish state, even though it wasn't called a state in the Balfour Declaration. But in 1938-39, they reversed course. They changed their minds, mainly under the impact of the threat of war with Germany and Italy and Japan. And they decided to get the Arabs on their side, and then turned their back on their commitment to Jewish statehood and became anti-Zionist. And this was the situation from 1938-39 until 48. But they weren't opposed in 48 once the Americans and the Russians and most of the democracies in the world supported Jewish statehood. They abstained in the vote at the United Nations in November 47, but they were not really opposed to Jewish statehood. Maybe they wanted to reduce the size of the Jewish state the United Nations had proposed in that resolution, but they weren't opposed to Jewish statehood. As you say, they probably didn't want, this also wasn't really formal policy, that they probably didn't want a Palestinian state to emerge under the leadership of a man who had collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. And the Arabs in general, incidentally, not only in Palestine, but in Egypt and other places in the Middle East, supported the Germans in World War II, not the Allies, for various reasons. We can go into that, but so the British weren't happy about a Palestinian victory in 48 or an Arab victory in 48. They sort of acquiesced in what the world wanted and what was represented in that United Nations vote, which was 33 for, 13 against, and 10 abstentions in November 1947, which favored the establishment of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state.
Okay. The next point is slightly related to what we're going to discuss later, how the Palestinians became refugees, but very briefly. The official version said that the Palestinians fled their homes of their own free will, but the new historian said that the refugees were chased out or expelled.
Yeah, well, the Israeli explanation for the creation of the refugees had two sides to it. The first was, as you say, the Palestinians who were left their homes, 700,000 of them, left because they feared being hurt in a war, caught up in the war. But they also, the Israeli official version was that Arab leaders had asked or advised them to leave. And the Arab version was, of course, that the Jews had, with premeditation in an organized fashion, expelled all the Arabs. And as I say, the new historiography found that the truth lay somewhere between those two versions. Some Arabs were expelled. Some Arabs left as on the advice or orders of other Arabs, Arab military commanders, local leaders, but most probably fled as a result of fear of being caught up in a war.
The next point is that the official version says that the balance of power was in favor of the Arabs, while the new historian said that Israel had the advantage both in manpower and in arms.
Yeah, well, this is strange because when you look at the map, the Arab world stretched from the Atlantic, Morocco to Iraq, and south to Saudi Arabia. So the Arabs had an enormous territorial, economic, manpower advantage, at least in potential. The point is that they didn't realize their potential on the battlefield. They didn't concentrate their energies and resources in the battlefield. And this is something the few Jews who lived in Palestine, numbering 650,000, did. They organized themselves well for war, and they concentrated their energies, and they were highly motivated, as I said. So they beat these Arab armies, which managed to field fewer troops than the Jews did.
Okay, I have two more. The official version said that the Arabs had a coordinated plan to destroy Israel, while the new historian said that the Arabs were actually divided.
Yeah, this is accurate, and I don't think it's just the new historians say that. I think most historians today who deal with the conflict agree on this. The Arabs, the official Israeli version was the Arab states launched the attack on Palestine on the 15th of May, 1948, in order to destroy the Jews and push them into the sea. It's not that clear that this was their intention. Jordan certainly, and Jordan had the best of the Arab armies, a small army, but the best of the Arab armies. Jordan had no intention of throwing the Jews into the sea and didn't try to do that. In fact, it preferred to have as its neighbor a Jewish state rather than the Palestinian Arab state. All the Jordanians were interested in doing was taking over and annexing the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which they actually managed more or less to do. The other Arab states may have also thought in terms somehow of maybe throwing the Jews into the sea, but this was never actually propagated as their official line. They never said this in public. Maybe radio stations said this, but not the Arab leaders. And probably what motivated them in the main was to show their own peoples, the leaders, to show their own peoples that they were really convinced anti-Zionists and would do what was necessary to attack the Jews. And also the leaders wanted to annex parts of Palestine for themselves. We know that the Egyptians were interested in occupying and perhaps even annexing the Negev Desert, the south of Palestine. The Jordanians, as I said, wanted the West Bank. The Syrians probably wanted the Sea of Galilee and the area around it. So they had annexationist reasons for invading Palestine, not merely helping the Palestinian Arabs or crushing the Jews.
Last one, and that's probably the most controversial one, right? The official version said that the Arabs actually prevented peace, while the new historian said that Israel is primarily responsible for not achieving peace.
I've reached the conclusion over years of study of this subject and thinking about it, that basically the Arab states, after being humiliated by the Jewish victory in 48, were unable to make peace with the Jewish state. Constitutionally unable, because they had just been humiliated. You don't make peace, in other words, surrender to your enemy after being so defeated in a war. But it's also true, and this is one of the things the new historian said, was that the Jews didn't offer the Arabs very much in terms of concessions to make peace. In other words, a return of the refugees or some of the refugees as demanded by the Arabs, some territory in the north. These things, the Israelis, after fighting a bitter war in which 1% of the Jewish population in Palestine was killed by the Arabs, they weren't willing to make concessions to a defeated enemy who just tried to crush them as they saw it. The Jews sincerely feared a Holocaust at Arab hands. Whether or not the Arabs would have done this, whether or not that was their intention, we don't know, but this is what the Jews felt the Arabs intended. So they weren't in open to giving the Arabs many concessions in return for peace, which made the Arabs less willing to make peace. Though, as I say, probably the Arab states were in no shape to make peace with the Jewish state after losing that war, except, and the exception here is Jordan. Jordan's King Abdullah was interested in making peace with the Jews. His army, in fact, had not really been defeated. They managed to occupy the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They'd fought the Jews, basically to a standstill. So they were sort of willing and conducted secret negotiations with Israel to make peace. But then the Arabs, of course, an Arab gunman assassinated King Abdullah because he was getting too close to the Jews, and that put an end to that. But the other Arab states, I believe, were not in a shape to make peace, to agree to peace with the Jewish state after 48. It took decades after, let's maybe add to it, it took decades more for Egypt to reconcile itself to a Jewish state and to peace with the Jewish state. And only after Egypt launched its own war in 1973 and managed to make achievements in that war, which, if you like, brought back some of their self-respect and honor and dignity to the Arab side. Then they were willing to make peace, but not after being humiliated in 1948.
They made peace, but it cost Sadat his life, right?
Yes, well, that's natural. I mean, in any Arab who wants to make peace with Israel, puts himself on the firing line by Arab extremists, sure.
Yeah. If we stay still in the past, yeah, can you elaborate on how the Palestinians actually became refugees and maybe also include Plan Dalet, Plan D?
I don't think Plan D, which is trumpeted by Arab propagandists and pro-Arab propagandists as a master plan of the Jews to expel the Palestinian Arabs. It was a Haganah, that is the main Jewish self-defense forces military plan from March 1948. They say that was an outline or a blueprint for the expulsion of the Palestinians. I think this is nonsense. The Plan D, as it says in its preamble, was a plan designed to fortify the Jewish state in face of the impending pan-Arab assault on Israel, but just before the Arab states invaded 2 months later, as in fact they did. But it did include some provisions what to do with villages which resisted or villages which were hostile to the Jews. And there it did say, you're to the local commanders who received the plan, you are allowed to destroy villages if you think that this is dangerous for us, and if you have not the troops to actually garrison the place. In other words, it gave carte blanche to the brigade commanders to destroy Arab villages, and some Arab villages were destroyed by brigade commanders, and many of them were destroyed subsequently. But the plan itself doesn't. This is only a minor element in the plan. The main thrust of the plan is the British are about to leave. The Arab states say they intend to invade the Jewish state. We must fortify the main roads, the main towns, and the border areas so that the Arab invasion does not succeed. And this is what Plan D is all about. You're asking more generally about why the Arab refugees became refugees. The main reason, and this is clear from the documentation, all the documentation, is that most of the Arabs feared that the Jews would attack their villages or were attacking their villages and would overcome them and kill people there, perhaps also commit atrocities in the villages. most Arabs simply wanted to move aside from the flail of war. They didn't want to be caught up in a war. And they thought that the Arabs would probably win and we'll go back to our villages. In addition to that, some places such as Lida and Ramla, for example, in July 48, were cleared of Arabs by Israeli expulsion and expulsion orders. But this only relates to, I would say, 10, 15% of the villages and towns. That is direct expulsion by Jewish troops, deliberate expulsion. Another 10 or 15 or 20% of the Arabs who became refugees were uprooted as a result of advice or orders by local Arab leaders or Arab military commanders, who basically said, let's move out of harm's way or get these people out of our path so that our armies, the Arab armies, can move in quietly without having to kill by the, collaterally all sorts of Arab communities. But the vast majority simply fled, and this is clear from the documentation. It's also true, and this I must add, that in the middle of the war, in June, July, August 1948, the Israeli government reached a decision and gave orders, appropriate orders to the IDF along the front lines, not to allow the refugees who had already become refugees to return. In other words, Israel barred a mass refugee return, and in fact used live fire to prevent refugees from returning to their homes. And that decision, which was reiterated and re-endorsed successively by Israeli government decisions in 48 and subsequent Israeli governments after the 48 war, made the refugee problem permanent.
One last question in regards to the expulsion, right? So I have in front of me an article that describes that within the first 9 months, more than 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed. Is that correct? I mean,
well, the number of 500 is, I think, an exaggeration. I think there were altogether 400 villages were depopulated and largely destroyed by the end of the war. I think the number is 400. Okay. And about 300 remained in the West Bank, in the Galilee, in Gaza, etc. I think there were altogether about 700 Palestinian villages. The question is, what is a village? Is 5 houses on a hill, is that a village? Or is that just 5 houses on a hill?
I'm looking at this from a behavior analysis perspective, right? And from a psychological point of view, the size of the village doesn't really matter, right? People are afraid.
That's not true. Look, you have a village and you have an argument between clans in the village. So one clan doesn't like the other clan. So the other clan sends a few of its families away from the village, and they set up camp on a hill, and then they build a house on the hill. Is that really a separate village? So some Arabs count those, what are called the khirbes, as villages. I don't. 400 villages is more or less what the British said were in the area which became Israel, actually more than 400, because some remained, but 400 were destroyed in the area that became the State of Israel in 1948.
All I'm saying is that if you start to destroy villages, large or small, it's understandable that people flee.
Well, no, no, you have it the wrong way around. In the war, the Israelis didn't have much artillery, and it was a very small and ill-equipped army in 48. So they didn't actually destroy villages and then people fled. What happened was they attacked villages which they thought were hostile, and most of the villages were hostile. They had militias which attacked Jewish traffic, Jewish neighbors, and so on. The Jews attacked them and the Arabs fled. Afterwards, they sometimes destroyed the villages, sometimes 10 years afterwards. The villages weren't destroyed first and then people left. People left as a result of fear of the war. And then when the Israelis took over the village, often they destroyed the village because they didn't want the Arabs to come back there.
Understand. Now, I have read an article of an interview, and there was one header, and I leave it up to you how to respond to that. And I also know that asking compound question is never a good idea, right? But it's the header, and I give you the header, and you feel free to respond to it. I read an interview where you were interviewed, I think, in 2004. It was one of those interviews where I really, that's what I meant at the very beginning. You are very frank and very pragmatic, right? And yes. One of the headers in this interview stated rape, massacre, and transfer. So, of course, being committed by the Israeli army. So can you comment on that?
Well, there were some rapes, very few. I mean, when you think of rape or whatever, Turkey and the Armenians or Russia and Germany, when the end of World War II, you're talking about mass rape. Here, there are a few cases of rape. There were massacres. There were several dozen massacres, as there were, incidentally, massacres by Arabs of Jews in the 1948 war as well. And there was transfer. There was essentially a driving out of a population and transferring it out of a country. These occurred. These are what the things which happened, sure.
Okay. So in your perspective, was Ben Gurion or the executive leadership, so to speak, in favor of, we can call it transfer, we can call it expulsion? What's your findings here?
I think Ben Gurion and some of the main leaders of the Zionist community from the 1930s supported transfer of Arabs, some Arabs or all Arabs, out of parts of Palestine or all of Palestine in principle. Their argument was that the Jews in Europe are being under threat of massacre, which they were, and eventually they were massacred. The Arabs in Palestine were busy shooting at the Jews, and if you wanted a safe haven for the Jews of Europe, somewhere where they could save themselves by coming to, it would be and make room for them to settle in Palestine, you need this space and you need this safety, and you can achieve that by transferring Arabs. They preferred, this is Ben Gurion, they preferred a voluntary transfer. In other words, get the Arabs, persuade the Arabs to take cash for their lands, for their houses, and move to Jordan or move into the West Bank or move into some other area other than the Jewish state, which is about to be achieved. Occasionally, Ben Gurion also said, our circumstances are such that we even support compulsory transfer, in other words, expulsion, because what we face is Holocaust, not just being moved out of our homes, but being murdered en masse. And it's better to have them move out than us being murdered en masse. But this never turned into official Zionist policy. No major party in the Jewish community in Palestine or the Zionist movement supported transfer as a solution, and never propagated it as part of a party platform, and neither did the Israeli government. But Israeli leaders like Ben Gurion hoped that the Arabs would move out, and that during the war itself in 48, hoped that more and more Arabs would move out to make room for the Jews and create more safety for the Jews in Palestine. Let me add one more thing to that. In 1937, during the Arab revolt against the British mandate in Palestine, the British sent a commission of inquiry to propose a solution to the Zionist Arab conflict in Palestine. And the Peel Commission proposed, among its proposals, a two-state solution, a division or partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab areas, and alongside that, the transfer of the Arabs out of the Jewish area to be. In other words, the Jews would get a small state without Arabs, because the Peel Commission argued that if you leave a number of Arabs inside the Jewish state, that's a recipe for continuous violence down the decades. If you move them out, there'll be a stable Jewish state and maybe a stable settlement as well. So the idea of transfer was partly planted in the minds of the Jewish leaders by this British Peel Commission, which was actually a very fair, very intelligent, very industrious commission which investigated the causes and the possible solutions to the problem. And the Zionist leaders were, of course, happy with both proposals, even though the Peel Commission proposed less than 20% of Palestine for Jewish statehood, meaning that about 80% would go for the Arabs, for Arab sovereignty. But alongside that, the transfer of Arabs out of the Jewish state area, the Zionist leaders were happy with that proposal, probably hoping the British would carry out the transfer, which the British, of course, immediately said no to the whole proposal, the British government, not the Peel Commission.
Okay. The next question is already a segue into the present tense, but it's also a two-pronged question. Yeah? So was the expulsion, we could also call it ethnic cleansing, justified? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, could it be justified under certain circumstances in the future?
Well, that's a heavy one. was the expulsion of the German minority in Czechoslovakia after World War II justified? In other words, the British, the Americans, and the Russians all agreed, let's expel those Germans who had basically helped to instigate World War II and help Hitler conquer all his neighbors. They should be punished for what they did, and they were expelled, and nobody said a word, basically. And these Germans ended up in Germany and became German citizens, and nobody talks about it anymore. In the circumstances in Palestine in 1947-48, the Arabs attacked the Jews. They refused to accept a compromise settlement based on the United Nations plan of partition. They said no Jewish state in any part of Palestine. We do not agree to that. And then they went to war against the Jews, the Palestinian Arabs to begin with in November, December 47. And they were followed by the Arab states who invaded Palestine, Israel in May 1948. Under those circumstances, with Arab neighbors shooting at Jewish neighbors, Arab villages shooting at their neighboring Jewish villages, cutting off the roads to for resupply to the Jewish villages. The only way the troops were able to function and eventually win the war was to clear out the villages which were attacking them. It's as simple as that. And you can ask a question that made sense in 48 itself. Then you can ask the question, but afterwards they didn't allow the Palestinian refugees back. But then you can say there were 700,000 Jews by the end of 48. There were 700,000 Jews in Palestine. Arab refugees numbered 700,000. There were another million, not a million. There were 160,000 Arabs still living in Israel who became Israeli citizens in 1949. If you add the 700,000 Palestinians who became refugees and you allow them back, you have 860,000 Arabs in the Jewish state, which has only 700,000 Jews. In other words, you turn the Jewish state instantly into an Arab majority state. Does this make sense, especially when you're talking about Arabs who just tried to destroy the Jewish state and kill their neighbors? So I basically understand and even justify the Israeli government's decision in 1949 not to allow the refugees back. They would have been a perpetual fifth column, and they would have instantly plunged Palestine again into anarchy and civil war, essentially. You're talking about the future. Well, again, let me add to that. Successive Israeli governments after 49 repeated this and said we cannot allow mass Palestinian refugee return because it will destabilize the state of Israel, basically lead to an Arab majority in the state of Israel, and we can't allow that if we want to maintain a Jewish state. The Arabs do have 22 states. Why should we now give them a 23rd state, the Jewish state, when the Jews have only one state? And they can go and live among their Arab brothers. They speak the same language. They pray to the same God. Why can't Arabs from Palestine live comfortably in Jordan or Lebanon and Syria? These are their brothers. It's not as if you're exiling them to Antarctica. As to the present, I don't support, in fact, I would condemn efforts to expel Arabs who are Israeli citizens from Israel today. Things which sometimes history allows you at certain points, you can't do when it just is immoral and impractical. It's both immoral and impracticable today to expel the Arabs of Israel. In 48, because, as I say, the Arabs were the aggressors, the Arabs threatened, so the Jews believed, a second Holocaust. It made sense that this is what happened. And the word expulsion also I don't like, especially because, as I told you, most fled. They weren't expelled. The expulsive decision was when they didn't allow them to return. But the actual departure of the Arabs from their homes, most of it was, if you like, under threat of war, nothing to do with expulsion orders.
I don't feel we have really answered the question in regards to the future.
Okay.
What would be potential circumstances under which a further expulsion or a complete expulsion might happen? Because it's not that fictitious, right?
Okay, I think it is. I don't think it's practical and I don't think it's moral. But I think if Israel was under a apocalyptic attack, if there was an atomic war, if the Arabs of Israel began to shoot at Israeli convoys moving towards the front, trying to confront Arab aggression from outside, then there might be grounds for expelling Arab communities who are participating in this war against their own state, the state of Israel. Then they might that would make sense. But I would say these would have to be really apocalyptic circumstances, and I don't see that happening. As it stands, expulsion is impractical and immoral.
When we talk about the Israeli Arabs, right, which are, you know this better than me, you know, in regards to integration and political views, how do you see that specific part of Israel's population? You see it as a threat, as a risk? How do you see that?
I see it both as a risk and as just a component of Israeli society. And it depends on how they behave and what they do. If they act as an enemy and try to destroy the Jewish state, try to intercept, as I said, convoys on roads, and then if Israel is under threat or under aggression at the specific point in time, then there's a problem. They are a time bomb. But if they respect the laws of the country and remain loyal to the state, even if they don't especially like living under Jewish rule, so be it. I mean, countries have minorities. Minorities don't often like the majorities which rule them or the governments under which they live, but they coexist, and that's the way the world is. But they can become a time bomb, and I've said this in the past. It depends on their behavior. I'm not saying they have to be cowed, loyal citizens, but they have to act according to the law.
Yeah. Now, moving really into the present. So I would briefly, well, not briefly, I mean, you know, the split between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. But before we do that, I have in front of me the new coalition agreement between, also for Netanyahu's present government. And if you allow me, I will briefly read it, because it states that the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right over all areas of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop the settlement of all parts of the land of Israel in the Dalet, the Negev, the Golan, in Judea and Samaria, which of course is the occupied West Bank. For an outsider like me, living in the safe haven of Netherlands here, for me that reads quite dramatic and you know, kind of connects to the potential of expulsion almost, right? But maybe I'm interpreting this not in the way it's meant.
Yeah, I think you're being a bit severe. I think what they're saying is that they would very much like to annex the West Bank and make it part of the state of Israel, what they call the land of Israel, down to the Jordan River. I disagree with that policy. I think that the Israel which came into existence in 1948-49, with the West Bank outside of Israel, those are the borders which are realistic and optimal. If Israel absorbed the West Bank as the settlement project hopes to do down the line, this is, I think, terrible for Israel, because Israel will become essentially a binational state, not a Jewish state, in terms of its demography. If you add to that the thought of expelling the population, well, then it's even more immoral and probably impractical, as I say, so it won't happen. So what you end up with is a Jewish state with a more or less equivalent Jewish and Arab populations, which again is no longer a Jewish state. It's a binational state, and I don't want that. I want a Jewish state which has a large Jewish majority, and possibly with the Arab minority which lives in it. They should stay, of course, and that makes sense, and that's what should be. Annexing the territories is bad for Israel. This is implied in this document, though I don't see any Israeli government, even under Netanyahu, annexing the West Bank, even though they would like to incorporate the West Bank into Israel proper, of course.
But even the statement itself feels quite threatening to anyone affiliated with Palestine, right?
Yes, I would. If I was a Palestinian, I would see that as a threat for sure.
Yeah. Now, coming to the topic of demography today. Now, we know that, you know, that Jewish society is divided between 80% Jews, about 20% Arabs. What's lesser known is you have an internal split in Israel between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. Now, I immersed myself a little bit into that topic, in preparation to that specific interview, and I would like to elaborate a little bit what's going on right now, because from my perspective, and I interviewed Miko Pelet not so long ago, I try to understand what's going on in Israel with those mass demonstrations, right? But now that I know about those two different branches of Jews, I understand. But I don't want to preempt your comment here. So what's going on in that respect here?
Well, things are complicated, as they are in most countries. Israel was founded by Ashkenazi Jews, Jews of European origin, who came before 1948 and settled the place and developed the kibbutzim and the government and the army and so on. Then in the 1950s, 60s, arrived masses of immigrants from Arab lands, Jews who lived in Arab lands. These communities were essentially pushed out of the Arab lands by the Arab societies amid which they lived, and most of them arrived in Israel. They were absorbed poorly, a large number of them. Israel was a poor country. It had to absorb enormous numbers of immigrants. Just to give you an example, Israel at the end of 1948 had 700,000 Jews. 3 years later, it had 1.4 million Jews. In other words, 700,000 Jews absorbed 700,000 Jewish immigrants within 3 years, which is, like if America today absorbed 300 million people from Latin America in 3 years, it would have 650 million people within 3 years, the United States. So what I'm saying is the absorption process was very difficult, and many of the Sephardi Jews, the Jews who came from Arab lands, felt that they weren't done by well, that they weren't given proper housing, proper education, proper jobs. Many of them came illiterate to the Jewish state, not on the same educational level as the Ashkenazi Jews who lived and established the state. So they got menial jobs, they didn't become, rocket scientists because they could hardly read or write, many of the Oriental Jews. So they felt discriminated against, and probably there was also real discrimination against them, partly for the same reasons. The sense of being done by and discriminated against went down the generations, something which Israel's leaders at the time didn't anticipate, went down the generations, was passed from generation to generation by those initially absorbed in the 1950s and 60s, passed on to their children and grandchildren. And even their grandchildren today resent the Ashkenazi secular leadership of the country for having not treated their forefathers and grandfathers well during the preceding decades. This translated in Israeli politics into votes for the right wing against the Israeli socialist establishment, which had established the state and led the state of Israel until 1977. This swing in the Sephardi vote gave Israel its first right-wing government in 1977, 30 years after Israel's establishment. And this Sephardi base of the Likud is continuing to support the Likud, partly, as I say, because of resentment against the Ashkenazi secular elite, as they call it, and partly because they also are anti-Arab. These Arab Jews who came from Arab lands and had suffered at Arab hands in Arab lands, pogroms, but always discrimination, occasional pogroms, but also discrimination by the Arabs, came with a bitterness towards the Arabs. And they translated that in Israel into right-wing politics. So they had two basic reasons for voting against the labor elite, which was a Ashkenazi secular elite. And this is why Israel has had since 1977 almost continuous government by the right wing, which is today called the Likud, and its other outliers, religious, national religious parties, Haredim, and so on.
If I understood this correctly, then the Ashkenazi Jews are kind of majority secular, while the Sephardic Jews are religious or observant, and they also get more children. And
well,
now
this was traditionally true, that the Sephardi's had higher birth rates than the Ashkenazi Jews. Now I think it's more or less evened out, except among Haredi Sephardim. That is, the Ultra Orthodox Sephardi Jews and the Ultra Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews have enormous birth rates, 7 and 8 children per family. And that's why their power in the Israeli parliament and therefore in Israeli politics continues to grow, because they have outbirthed the secular Jewish majority, which used to exist or still exists, but barely.
Outbirth, yeah. If we connect this now to the recent demonstrations, my understanding is that there is a power struggle between those two fractions, if you will, especially when it comes to the Supreme Court. So the Ashkenazi Jews, they had all the political power, one of which is, of course, represented in the Supreme Court, where I believe 13 of the 15 judges were from Ashkenazi descent and only 2 from non-Ashkenazi, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the Supreme Court in the past, in some way, was able to, how shall I say this, manage, regulate, or discipline the government or the deeds of the Israeli government. So if the Sephardic Jews would take over the Supreme Court, this, of course, would have direct consequences for all of Israel. And now that I know that, I also look at the demonstrations physically in a different sense, because whom do you see on the streets? You don't see, traditional Jewish clothing or faces, or you see the secular Jews demonstrating on the street. Right?
Yeah.
Please.
The mass demonstrations you see against the government and what it calls judicial reform in the streets of Israel every Saturday night, they're mostly secular Ashkenazi Jews. But there are also a smattering of religious Jews and a smattering of Sephardi Jews who don't like the government, who don't like its efforts to take over the Supreme Court. The fact that the Supreme Court is mostly Ashkenazi is, I think, mainly because those are the people who did well in law, who became law professors and good lawyers and so on. And that's why they are in the Supreme Court, not because of the color of their skin or because they emerged from a certain type of family. But it's a misrepresentation of where power lies in Israel, the way you just described it. There are 3 branches to the government in Israel, as well as in America and other places. The Sephardi base controls the Knesset, and the Sephardi base basically controls the government and has done so since 1977, even though paradoxically the leader of the Likud traditionally has been an Ashkenazi Jew. This is one of the paradoxes, Menachem Begin, and today nobody's more Ashkenazi than Bibi Netanyahu in terms of his origins and the outlook and so on. But the Sephardi base actually does control the 2 main branches of government. The Supreme Court has acted as a sort of a brake on the government. Otherwise, the government would run riot and perhaps turn into dictatorship. And that's what the demonstrations in the streets are about today. They don't want the Supreme Court to be taken over by the government and its agents. It's not really to do with Sephardim and Ashkenazim in the Supreme Court. It's to do with the rule of law, or setting aside and pushing aside the law and the legal requirements to allow the government a free rein in what it wants to do towards Arabs, to do towards settlements, to do towards the army's behavior in various places, and so on. And this is what the struggle is about. It's about not letting the Supreme Court be taken over by the government, which is led by the Likud and a lot of mad Messianic Jews.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you allow me the question, where are you on this topic?
Well, I think I made it fairly clear. I'm with the demonstrators, and I hope to God that the government does not succeed. And it looks like it's not succeeding, not so much because of the demonstrations, the popular groundswell against what's happening, but because I think Netanyahu is well attuned to international opinion and the American government and what the American government wants. And the American government wants Israel to remain a democracy, not basically a one-party state. Netanyahu knows that. And I think the Israeli economy also is already suffering from these efforts to change the judicial system. And so Netanyahu is attuned to that as well, that Israel will economically lose ground, a lot of ground, if this semi-dictatorship takes form. What they're aiming for, at least were trying to, at the start of the so-called judicial reform, was to establish a type of government consonant or similar to Hungary's or Poland's. And this isn't something Israelis normal Israelis want.
Now that you mentioned Netanyahu a couple of times, how is the situation connected to his to his political fate, right? I mean, he is charged with corruption. He has a number of
his personal fate is involved in this. I'm not sure whether that was the thing driving his support for judicial reform, though to be sure, he is now on trial for corruption, on corruption charges, and most people believe he will be found guilty of these corruption charges, though there's nothing as corrupt as Trump, but he's on the same path, basically. They're not as far advanced as Trump. Tinkering with the judicial system and making it more obedient to the government's will might actually get Netanyahu off the hook in terms of his personal trial. This is part of the story. But I think it's only a small part of the story, because I think he can rely on the foot dragging in the courts, and they can go on forever here. You have 500 witnesses for each of the trials, and there's 3 separate counts at the moment against Netanyahu, and there's the court he's at it now, and he'll eventually appeal to the Supreme Court. He'll be about 85 by the time the judgments come in, and by then probably he will no longer be prime minister. So I don't think the judicial reform is what's the thing which he hopes will save him. He will be saved by the foot dragging by the courts in terms of his personal fate. Yeah.
The mere fact that he went into coalition with such a right-wing coalition, what does that tell us? I mean, from where I'm standing, from the outside again, it almost looks like an act of desperation. There's no corner anymore.
It is an act of desperation. I think he was fearful also of losing power, because if he didn't go into a coalition with these people, and the other liberal center parties did not want to go into coalition with Netanyahu because he's on trial. He shouldn't be prime minister at all if he's on trial. That's the logic. That's what plain logic says. He understood he had to go, either he resigned from the premiership or go with the extreme right-wing parties and the religious parties. So that's what he did. But I'm not sure it's driven simply by fear for his personal fate and sitting in jail. As I say, I think this can take a long, long time, and until that materializes.
Yeah. What would be a next possible step? I mean, further right is hardly possible anymore, right? So, I mean, is there not a dead end in sight already?
I don't know. The problem is that the Israeli demography is such that every election there are more and more right-wing voters and more Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox voters. So if they have a bare majority today in the Knesset of 64 seats out of 120, in the next election, if everybody votes according to their origins, their demographic origins, they'll have 70 seats in the next election. So it looks like Israel's moving towards the right. Yes, that's the situation. Towards the right and towards a more religious state.
A question in between, because you just mentioned them, ultra Orthodox Jews, right? Again, me sitting in kind of a media bubble here, I'm seeing more and more confrontations between the Israeli army and the Orthodox. I mean, violent, like beating, like water cannons, like what's going on there?
Well, no, the Israeli army doesn't deal with demonstrations and beatings. The problem with ultra-Orthodox is that they do not serve in the army. And that's the question, not whether they fight with the army. They don't. There's no places where they clash. But they don't want to serve in the army. They prefer living off government subsidies, many of them not working at all, and not serving in the 3 years in the army like secular Israeli Jews do. And that's the bitter controversy. But that's the end point of it. The base of the controversy is that they do not give to society what society gives them. They don't contribute to society. As I say, many of the males, most ultra-Orthodox males, do not work. They live off government subsidies, and they create lots of children, 7 or 8 children per family, and they live off of government subsidies. And so they can procreate endlessly and more than the secular Jews who are financing them. And this in a sense, will maybe bring down the state of Israel, because you can't have a growing large minority being parasitic, living as parasites of people who just don't want it. Some of the people who don't want it say they will simply leave Israel, and this is what's beginning to happen now. And most don't feel comfortable with it, just serving this ultra Orthodox minority and its ends, which, as I say, are parasitic.
And the political direction of the Ultra Orthodox are aligned with whom? With the right-wing government?
Yes, they traditionally, the Ultra Orthodox in 1948, 49, 50, and so on, there were a very, very small number of them. As I say, they've managed to grow enormously because of birth rates. But traditionally, they were anti-Zionist. They didn't believe the Jews should set up their state. Only God should set up a Jewish state. And the Ben Gurion and all the rest of them were seen as sort of like heretics, people who had rejected religion, rejected God, and were doing something God did not approve of. But over the last 2 or 3 decades, they have moved towards the right and towards becoming nationalist. So they basically supported anything the right-wing parties support, which is, if you like, a growing annexation of the West Bank, settlements in the West Bank. Some of the largest settlements in the West Bank today are Haredi, completely Haredi settlements.
Yeah. Now, if you allow me, the last couple of minutes, I have 2 or 3.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. So very briefly, the Amnesty International report that came out, which is called Automated Apartheid. So the last couple of minutes I would like to make about the Palestinians and the living conditions within Israel, right? So again, Amnesty International came out with a report called Automated Apartheid. It's basically artificial intelligence is being used, cameras, high resolution cameras, artificial intelligence on all checkpoints, and a big data bank. I work in IT, so, and the big data bank in the background who collects basically everything, right? So where is this going? Where is this going?
Well, I don't know. The word apartheid I find problematic. Apartheid in South Africa was several million whites lording it over 30 or whatever it is million blacks who had no rights, no voting rights, no living in certain places, no movement rights. Here, Israeli Arabs, there's 1.5 million Israeli Arabs alongside 7 million Israeli Jews. That's the citizenship of the state of Israel. They live perfectly equal lives. They may not be quite as wealthy as the Jews altogether. They may not be completely as educated as the Jews, but they are in universities in large numbers, in technological companies in growing numbers. They don't serve in the IDF, so they also have some gains from being a minority which is not completely trusted. But they basically enjoy civil rights, all full civil rights in face of the law. The problem when it comes to apartheid is the Arabs who live in the occupied territories who are not citizens of the state of Israel. You have about 2.5 million Arabs living in the West Bank and maybe close to 2 million today in the Gaza Strip. They don't really live under Israeli control, government in the Gaza Strip, but they are controlled by Israel, which controls the Gaza Strip from outside. And in the West Bank, they are controlled by Israeli troop presence, roadblocks, and so on. And there is some form of apartheid emerging. In other words, and this has been the situation which has grown worse in the last 50 years of occupation. Even roads which only Jews use, and most of it is to do with terrorism, the fear by Israel of terrorism by Arabs in the West Bank. And there is terrorism. Cars drive by and shoot up Israeli cars and so on. But it does mean that the Israelis who live in the West, the Jews who live in the West Bank are Israeli citizens, enjoy full rights, and the Arabs who live in the West Bank are not citizens and don't enjoy any rights, basically. And this is a terrible situation to be in, and that's what military occupations means. Israel shouldn't be in occupation of another people, shouldn't be lording it over another people. But on the other hand, if Israel leaves the West Bank, it'll turn into another Gaza Strip. It'll turn into a Hamas-dominated area from which the Arabs will shoot rockets into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. How do you get out of the West Bank if they don't want peace with you? This is the problem.
I understand. So I also saw from multiple interviews that you don't offer a solution. You said you're a historian. You're
yes,
not.
I have no solution. It's a ridiculous situation, and I have no solution. No.
I have, lastly, my last question. I have a personal question because I suffer from what we call cognitive dissonance. I have contradictory beliefs in my system, and I don't find a way how to align them. And my contradictory beliefs is that on an emotion.
Can I recommend a good psychiatrist?
Thank you. I will come over. Yeah. So on one side, on an almost instinctive and emotional level, I completely understand coming out of the Second World War, having suffered as a Jewish person, having suffered from what happened before, during, and after the Second World War. Even after the Second World War, it was, in many countries very, very bad. Yeah, I completely understand. You want to have safety for you, for your family. You want a state. I completely understand. Yeah, I'm not justifying what Israel did, right? But then when I shift over and I see what's happening today, done by Israel to Palestine, I cannot associate myself with it. There's no reason.
Look, I understand what you're saying. I understand the problem, and I have similar feelings. But I would by no means compare it to what happened to Jews in World War II to the way the Palestinians are living today. There's a vast distance. Today, there's basically what we have is a conflict between two national groups. Two peoples are fighting over a piece of land. That's what it all stems from: the occupation, the wars, it's the terrorism, the counterterrorism. It's all to do with a war between two peoples fighting each other. In World War II, during World War II, in the midst of World War II, the Germans began killing millions of Jews. Germans helped by various people, including some Dutchmen. And they were just killing a minority, which was no danger to anybody, for mad reasons, essentially. So it's not, there's no comparison. And of course, what Israel does to the Palestinians has no comparison at all to what happened to Jews in World War II. We're fighting a war, and there are casualties. There are Israeli casualties. There are Arab casualties. Unfortunately, this has involved a long occupation of another people, which is terrible for the people themselves, for those people themselves, and for the Israelis who have to occupy them. I feel terrible about it, but this is what where history has placed us.
Yeah, to be very clear, I'm not comparing Holocaust with what happens now
in
Palestine.
But
on an emotional level, and I'm not even talking about, you said there's war. No, I'm talking about the normal Palestinian people who are not engaged in terrorism, who are not involved in war. If I see, there's so iconic images now who resemble, I'm not comparing again, who resemble, caged people who resemble pictures from 45.
I see what you're saying, and I have no response. It's a problem that the Jewish people ended up in this situation is just terrible. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Morris, one last thing, and this is for you.
No, you said before the last.
No, it's not a question. It's not a question. I'm giving you the opportunity. If there's anything you would like to say, to encapsulate your acquired wisdom, a message for a future generation, a message for the government or whatever, what would it be?
No, I don't. You're giving me too much. I don't think I have encapsulated any wisdom. I actually know some of the facts. That's what I have. It's not wisdom, it's facts, and I know what happened. The assessments can be wise or not. That's up to the observer. But no, I have nothing I can offer. No.
There's no message from Professor Benny Morris. Okay, good. Well, I still thank you very much for your time. It's highly, highly appreciated. And again, thank you for your candor in this discussion, in many other discussions, and in your writings.
Thank you very much.
I wish you all the best from Amsterdam to Israel.
Same to you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.